somewhere in a cave in northern Spain, pressed into a wall of limestone so deep inside the mountain that no daylight has ever reached it, there is a hand. Not a painting of a hand, not a carving, a hand. Someone pressed their palm flat against cold stone, put a hollow reed to their lips, and blew pigment around it until the shape of their fingers was burned into the rock forever. It is small, about the size of yours. The fingers are slightly spread, the way your hand spreads when you press it against something cold and unfamiliar. The thumb curves at the same angle yours does. The proportions are identical to a hand you would pass on the street today without a second thought. This hand is 40,000 years old. The person who made it had no alphabet, no agriculture, no metal, no wheel, no city, no market, no doctor, no written law. They had a reed and some pigment and a wall and the desire, for reasons we will never fully know, to leave something behind that said they had been here. And it worked. 40,000 years later, you are here. And you know they were. Now hold that thought for a moment, because that hand is not the beginning of the story we are going to tell tonight. It is closer to the middle. By the time that hand was pressed into that wall, the human species had already been surviving on this planet for more than 250,000 years. 250,000 years of ice and fire and drought and darkness and disease before that person ever picked up a reed. And the question, the one that quietly sits at the center of everything we know about our own existence, is how. How does one animal do that? Not the largest animal, not the fastest, not the strongest, not the one with the sharpest teeth, or the thickest hide, or the most effective venom. One animal with no claws worth mentioning, no armor, no natural weapon that would frighten anything larger than a rabbit, an animal that cannot outrun a horse, cannot outswim a crocodile, cannot overpower a bear, cannot survive a single night in serious cold without external help. That animal, how does it survive for 300,000 years on a planet that has in that same period buried entire species under glaciers, swallowed coastlines into the sea, blocked out the sun with ash for years at a time, and driven creatures far larger and better equipped than us into extinction so complete that we only know they existed because of what their bones left behind in stone? 99% of all species that have ever existed on this earth are gone. Gone completely. Not diminished, not reduced. Gone. The default outcome of being alive on this planet is extinction. That is not a dramatic statement. That is simply what the fossil record shows over and over, across hundreds of millions of years. And yet here we are. That is not a small thing to explain. That is the whole thing. Before we go any further, let's make this personal. Because it is. Every large mammal that shared this planet with your earliest ancestors is gone. The woolly mammoth, the cave lion, the giant ground sloth, the saber-toothed cat, the cave bear, the short-faced bear which stood 6 feet tall at the shoulder and could run faster than a horse, the direwolf, the aurochs, the woolly rhinoceros. All of them larger than us, all of them larger than us, all of them better armed, all of them, by any reasonable measure, more physically suited to survival in the world they lived in than the small, slow, furless primate that was watching them from a distance. All of them gone. We are still here. Now, there is a version of this story that makes that sound inevitable. That says, of course, humans survived. We are intelligent. We have big brains. We use tools. We cooperate. We were always going to make it. That version is comfortable. It makes survival feel like something we earned, something we deserved. It is also not entirely honest, because there were moments, real documented, measurable moments in the geological and genetic record, when the entire human population of this planet dropped to numbers that should not have been survivable. Not millions, not hundreds of thousands. Thousands, possibly fewer. There was at least one point in our history when the number of human beings alive on Earth was smaller than the current population of a small town, smaller than the number of people who might attend a local football match on a Saturday afternoon, smaller than the number of people you might pass on a busy street in an hour. That is how close it came. And the remarkable thing, the thing that sits at the heart of everything we are going to explore tonight, is not that we survived those moments. It is what we did during them. It is what a species does when it is reduced to almost nothing, and the world around it is hostile and cold and dark and getting worse. Because it turns out the answer is not what most people expect. It is not the brain, not the spear, not the fire exactly, not the tools. It is something quieter than all of those things, something so simple that when scientists first began piecing it together from the evidence, some of them found it almost difficult to believe that something so ordinary could have made the difference between existence and disappearance. We will get to that. We will earn it. But first you need to understand how close the edge actually was, because you are listening to this tonight because someone, a very long time ago, did not give up on a night that was very much worse than this one. You are the end of an unbroken chain of survival so long it disappears into the dark. Not one person in that chain, not one single ancestor going back 300,000 years, failed to survive long enough to pass something forward. Every crisis, every winter, every catastrophe, every year when the food ran short and the cold came early and the group was smaller than it had been the year before. Someone made it through, and that someone eventually, across hundreds of thousands of years and an almost incomprehensible number of generations, became the person lying in the dark right now, listening to this story about how they got here. That is who this is about. That is what tonight is about. So settle in. Let the weight of the day ease off. We are going back a very long way, and the story is worth every step. Now, before we go any further, there is something important to say about how we are going to tell this story tonight, because this particular subject, human survival, human origins, the question of how we got here, attracts a certain kind of telling. You have probably encountered it, the version that starts with a reasonable question and then, somewhere around the third paragraph, is talking about ancient astronauts or lost super civilizations, or the idea that somebody somewhere is hiding the real truth about where human beings came from. That is not what we are doing here. And the reason I want to say that clearly at the beginning, before we go anywhere near the evidence, is not because I think you are likely to confuse this for that kind of story. You are probably not. The reason is that the actual documented, peer-reviewed, argued over 4 decades version of this story is so much stranger and more genuinely unsettling than any of those shortcuts that it deserves to be told cleanly, without any of that noise attached to it. The real story does not need embellishment. It does not need mystery added to it. It is already one of the most extraordinary things that has ever been documented by science. So here is what we are going to do instead, and this matters because it will shape how you hear everything that follows. We are going to follow the evidence the way scientists actually followed it, which means we are going to start with what was observed in the fossil record, in the genetic record, in the archaeological record, and we are going to ask what that evidence actually forces us to conclude and what it leaves genuinely open. There will be moments tonight where the answer is we do not know. Not we haven't figured it out yet, but we have a strong theory. Genuinely, honestly, the evidence does not currently support a firm conclusion, and scientists who study this for a living actively disagree about it. We are going to say that when it is true, there will also be moments where the evidence is so consistent, so thoroughly examined from so many different angles, by so many different research teams, using so many different methods, that the conclusion is about as solid as anything in science ever gets. We are going to say that when it is true too. The distinction matters because this is a subject where confident claims are made constantly by people with varying degrees of actual engagement with the primary research. And learning to hear the difference between this is what the evidence shows, and this is what someone wants the evidence to show, is one of the most useful things you can carry away from a story like this one. Now, there is also a simpler version of the survival story that I want to name and set aside, because you will have heard it, and because it is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. The simple version goes like this: humans survived because we are intelligent. We developed big brains. Big brains allowed us to make tools and use fire and cooperate in groups and outcompete every other species we encountered. Intelligence is the explanation for everything. There is truth in that. But here is the problem with it. Neanderthals had big brains. In fact, by some measures, their brains were slightly larger than ours on average. They used tools. They controlled fire. They buried their dead with what looks very much like ritual intention. They made jewelry and used pigment and survived Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before we arrived. They are gone. Homo erectus, our much older relative, had fire, had tools, was resourceful enough to spread from Africa across the entirety of Asia and into parts of Europe, survived for nearly 2 million years, longer than our species has existed by a factor of 6. Gone. Homo heidelbergensis, Homo naledi, Denisovans, a whole family of large-brained, tool-using, fire-controlling human relatives, each one of them surviving for long stretches of geological time, each one of them gone. So intelligence alone is not the answer, or rather, intelligence is part of the answer, but only part of it, and not even the most important part, which is something that takes a while to see clearly in the evidence, and which we are going to build toward carefully tonight. What we are going to do is look at the actual moments, specific, datable, physically evidenced moments when the human species nearly disappeared. And we are going to ask at each of those moments what specifically made the difference. What was it precisely that some humans had or did or were connected to that allowed a small enough number of them to survive that they could eventually become the 8 billion people alive on Earth today? The answer, when it comes, is going to be simpler than you expect, and more beautiful. But we have to earn it first. And earning it means going back to the beginning. Back to the first crisis. Back to the moment when the evidence first told scientists that the story was not the straightforward march of progress they had assumed it was. It starts not in a cave, not in a fossil bed, not in an archaeological dig. It starts in a genetics laboratory in the early 1990s with a dataset that made no sense, and a scientist staring at numbers that seem to be telling him something impossible. Before we get there, though, just a moment. If you are already feeling that pull towards sleep, that loosening behind the eyes, that slight heaviness in the limbs that comes when you have been still and warm for long enough, that is exactly what this is for. This is ancient world sleep, where the longest, deepest stories in human history are told slowly enough and quietly enough to carry you all the way into sleep. You do not need to follow every word. You do not need to stay awake for the conclusion. The story will be here when you come back to it, and if you drift off somewhere in the middle of a genetic laboratory in the 1990s, or on a coastline in southern Africa 74,000 years ago, that is not a failure. That is the whole point. If you are new here, consider subscribing. Every episode goes somewhere different and somewhere old. We have been to the lovers of Valdaro, two Neolithic skeletons found locked in an embrace in northern Italy. We have been to the ancient African man called Mungo Man, the oldest human remains ever found in Australia, sleeping in the red earth for 40,000 years. Tonight we are going further back than either of those. Tonight we're going back to the edge of everything. And if you want these episodes completely clean, no ads, no interruptions, just the voice and the story and nothing else, you can follow Ancient Worlds Sleep on Spotify. The link is in the description. It is free. It takes about 10 seconds. And it means the next time you need something to carry you into sleep, it will be right there waiting. One more thing before we go back. Where in the world are you right now? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments if you feel like it. There is something genuinely extraordinary about knowing that someone is listening to this in Edinburgh at 2 in the morning, while someone else is listening in Manila at 9 in the evening, while someone in Sao Paulo is just settling in for the night. All of them in different time zones, in different beds, drifting off into the same story about how their species nearly ceased to exist. The geography of this audience is its own kind of map of human survival. So, back to the genetics laboratory. Back to the numbers that didn't make sense. Back to the beginning of the answer. In the early 1990s, a geneticist sat in front of a dataset that should not have looked the way it did. The numbers were wrong. Not wrong in the sense of a calculation error. Not wrong in the sense of a contaminated sample or a methodological flaw. Wrong in a deeper sense. Wrong in the sense that they were telling a story about the human species that contradicted almost everything the scientific community had assumed for decades. To understand what he was looking at, you need to understand one thing about genetics first. And it is a simple thing. Simple enough to carry in one hand. When a population is large and stable over a long period of time, its genetic diversity increases. Mutations accumulate slowly, generation after generation. Different groups develop slightly different genetic variants. The longer a population has been large and healthy, the more variation you find written into its genome. The more different the individuals within that population are at the level of the genetic code from one another. This is not controversial. This is basic population genetics, as well established as anything in biology. Now, here is what that means for what the geneticist was looking at. Humans, by every measure of history and archaeology, are an old species. We have been on this planet for at least 300,000 years. We have been numerous enough at various points to spread across an entire continent and eventually across the entire surface of the Earth. We have been, by any reasonable assumption, a successful and persistent species for an extraordinarily long time. You would therefore expect, if you sat down with a dataset of human genetic variation from populations around the world, to find enormous diversity. Deep variation, the accumulated differences of 300,000 years of separate populations living in separate environments, developing separate genetic variants, diverging slowly and steadily the way populations do when they are numerous and widespread and old. That is what you would expect. That is not what he found. What the data showed was something that, when he first saw it, apparently required several rounds of checking before anyone was willing to accept it. Humans are almost genetically identical, not similar, not closely related in the way that members of the same species are always somewhat closely related. Almost identical. The genetic diversity within the entire human species, all 8 billion of us spread across every continent speaking thousands of languages, separated by oceans and mountain ranges and tens of thousands of years of geographical isolation, is smaller than the genetic diversity within a single troop of chimpanzees living in one forest in West Africa. Read that again, because it is important. A few hundred chimpanzees in one forest in one country carry more genetic variation among themselves than all of humanity combined. This is one of the most startling facts in all of biology, and yet it is completely, thoroughly, exhaustively confirmed. It has been checked and rechecked by hundreds of research teams using increasingly sophisticated methods over 3 decades. The number keeps coming back. The conclusion keeps standing. We are, genetically speaking, extraordinarily similar to one another, and that can only mean one thing. At some point, at some specific datable point in our history, the human population crashed, not declined, not reduced, crashed, dropped so severely, so suddenly, so completely, that almost everyone died. The technical term for this is a population bottleneck, a moment when the thread of a species becomes so thin that it nearly breaks, when the pool of surviving individuals is so small that all the genetic diversity accumulated over previous generations is essentially wiped out, replaced by the narrow genetic profile of whoever happened to survive. Every human being alive today, every single one of us, descends from the small group of people who made it through that bottleneck. Whatever they had, whatever they were, whatever they did that allowed them to survive when almost everyone else did not. That is in us. Literally. Written into the genome, carried forward in every cell of every body of every person who has ever lived from that moment until right now, in this room tonight. The question the data raised immediately was, how small? How small did the population actually get? And the answer, when researchers began working backward through the genetic record to try to calculate it, was the kind of number that tends to produce a particular quality of silence in a room. The estimates vary depending on the methodology and the assumptions built into the models. The range that has emerged from multiple independent research efforts using different data sets and different analytical approaches is somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals. The middle of that range, the number that appears most consistently, is somewhere around 10,000 people total, perhaps fewer. Some models using the most conservative assumptions have suggested the breeding population may have dropped as low as a few hundred pairs. Think about what that means. A few thousand people, possibly fewer, on an entire planet, the last remnant of a species that had been present on the Earth for hundreds of thousands of years. Not spread evenly across the landscape either, concentrated, almost certainly, in one or a few refugia, specific places where conditions were survivable when almost everywhere else had become unsurvivable. Everyone else was gone. Everyone who had gone before them, Every person who had ever walked a different path, spoken a different proto-language, carried a slightly different genetic variant, lived in a slightly different place on a slightly different diet. Gone. The only thing left was this small group in their refuge, not knowing they were the last ones, building fires and finding food and doing the daily work of staying alive without any awareness that the entire history of their species had narrowed to the width of what they could accomplish in a single generation. Now, when scientists began trying to date this bottleneck, trying to identify not just that it happened, but when it happened, something emerged from the data that was, in retrospect, almost obvious. The timing pointed to a specific period, a period that, when geologists looked at their own records for the same window of time, produced an immediate and uncomfortable recognition. Because something else had happened at almost exactly that moment, something large enough to leave a layer in the ice cores of Greenland, something large enough to be readable in ocean sediment cores pulled from the floor of the Indian Ocean. Something large enough that when researchers first identified its signature in the geological record, they could not quite believe the scale of what they were looking at. It was not a gradual climate shift. It was not a slow deterioration of conditions over thousands of years. It was a single event. One morning, roughly 74,000 years ago, the sky began to change, and it did not go back to normal for years. There is an island in the middle of what is now Indonesia, surrounded by warm equatorial water, covered in dense tropical forest, sitting on top of one of the most geologically unstable patches of Earth's crust anywhere on the planet. Today it is called Sumatra. And roughly 74,000 years ago, a mountain on that island did something that, in the entire history of our species, nothing has done before or since. It erupted, not the way volcanoes erupt in the news, not the way Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, which killed 57 people and flattened forests across a radius of 30 kilometers, and was described at the time as one of the most significant volcanic events in modern history. Not like that. Mount Toba erupted with a force that makes every volcanic event in recorded human history look like a small fire in a large field. The numbers, when you lay them out plainly, are almost impossible to hold in the mind. 2,800 cubic kilometers of material ejected into the atmosphere in what geologists estimate was a matter of days. To put that in terms that means something, the eruption of Mount St. Helens ejected approximately 1 cubic kilometer of material. Toba ejected 2,800 times that volume. The ash cloud that resulted was not a regional event. It was not a continental event. It was a planetary event. Ash from Toba has been found in ice cores pulled from Greenland, thousands of miles to the north. It has been found in ocean sediment cores from the floor of the Indian Ocean. It has been found in lakebed sediments in East Africa and deposits in India so thick in some places 6 meters deep that the layer is visible to the naked eye in road cuts and cliff faces today. 6 meters of ash from a single eruption fallen across an entire subcontinent. The immediate effects would have been overwhelming at a local scale. Everything within hundreds of kilometers of the eruption simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The heat, the pyroclastic flows, the sheer physical obliteration of the landscape in every direction from the caldera. Nothing survived that. But it is not the immediate effects that matter most for the human story. It is what happened to the atmosphere in the weeks and months and years that followed. When a volcanic eruption of this magnitude injects that volume of material into the upper atmosphere, the sulfur dioxide, the ash particles, the aerosols, it does something to sunlight. It reflects it, scatters it, prevents it from reaching the surface with its usual intensity. The result is what scientists call a volcanic winter. The sun does not disappear. The sky does not go completely dark. But the light becomes wrong, dimmer than it should be. The warmth that sunlight normally delivers to the surface of the Earth is reduced, degree by degree, as the aerosol veil spreads through the stratosphere and circles the planet. The estimates for how much global temperatures dropped in the immediate aftermath of Toba vary between different models and different research teams. The range that appears most consistently in the literature is somewhere between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius of average global cooling. Some models suggest the cooling may have been as severe as 10 to 15 degrees in certain regions, particularly at higher latitudes. 3 to 5 degrees does not sound like much. But consider what that means for the living world. Growing seasons shorten. The plants that humans and the animals they hunted depended on fail to produce at their normal rate. Forests that are precisely calibrated to their local temperature regime begin to thin, to contract, to retreat toward the equator. Grasslands dry. Rivers run lower. The animals that depend on those grasslands and those rivers move, or decline, or disappear. And the humans who depend on those animals and those plants find themselves in a world that is producing less food in every direction than it was the year before. Now hold that picture for a moment, because there is something important to add to it. When Toba erupted 74,000 years ago, the human species was not large. We were not numerous. The entire human population of the Earth at that moment was probably somewhere in the region of 100,000 individuals, scattered in small groups across the African continent, with possibly some populations in Levant and the Arabian Peninsula. 100,000 people on the entire planet. And then Toba happened. The volcanic winter that followed the eruption lasted, depending on which model you consult, somewhere between 6 and 10 years of acute cooling, followed by a longer period of climatic instability that may have persisted for 1,000 years or more. 1,000 years of a world that was colder, drier, less productive, and less predictable than the world that had existed before the eruption. For small scattered groups of people living entirely off what the landscape provided, with no stored food supply beyond what could be cached for a single season, with no ability to trade across distances for resources when local supplies failed. 1,000 years of that is not a manageable hardship. It is a near-extinction event. The ash layers tell the story with a precision that still feels startling when you understand what you are looking at. In site after site across southern Africa, East Africa, and India, archaeologists found the Toba ash layer, that distinctive chemical signature, that identifiable geological marker, sitting in the earth like a line drawn by the event itself. And what was above it was different from what was below it. Below the ash layer, evidence of human occupation, tools, hearths, animal bones bearing the cut marks of stone blades, the ordinary debris of people living their lives. Then the ash layer, and then, above it, in many sites, a gap, a silence in the record, a period with no evidence of human presence, an absence where there had been a presence. The human population of Africa, already small, appears to have crashed in the immediate aftermath of Toba to a fraction of what it had been. The specific number, that bottleneck figure of somewhere between 1 and 10,000 breeding individuals, lines up with the Toba timeline with uncomfortable precision. Different methods of analysis, starting from different data sets, arriving at different points in the research literature, keep pointing to the same general window. The crash happened around the same time as the eruption. What the evidence shows clearly and consistently is that the timing overlaps. that the genetic signature of a near-extinction event in human history and the geological signature of the largest volcanic eruption in the last 2 million years point to the same narrow window of time, and that after that window, after the ash and the volcanic winter and the population crash and the 1,000 years of difficult, unstable climate, something happened, something small, something quiet, something that left traces in the archaeological record that researchers have spent decades learning to read. A few people survived, and in the way they survived, in the specific things the archaeological evidence shows them doing in the years and decades after the sky went wrong, there is a story about what our species actually is that is more interesting and more moving than anything the simple version of the intelligence narrative can offer. Let go of the numbers for a moment. Let go of the ash layers in the genetic datasets and the stratigraphic columns and the cubic kilometers of ejected material. Let go of all of it and come down to something smaller. Come down to a single fire. It is small. Smaller than you would want it to be. The wood along this part of the coast is not abundant, and what there is has been gathered carefully, carried back by the children because the children are the ones who can be spared for that task while the adults do the heavier work of finding enough food to get through another day. The fire is small, but it is enough. It is enough to push the dark back to a comfortable distance. It is enough to keep the things in the dark at a comfortable distance too. It is enough to sit beside without shivering, as long as you sit close and pull your covering tight around your shoulders. The woman sitting beside it tonight is not old, not by the measure of years we would use, but she is old by the measure of the life she has lived. There are things written in her face and in the way she holds her body that have no direct translation into language, but that you would recognize immediately if you sat across a fire from her. A particular quality of attention. A stillness that is not relaxation, but vigilance that has become so habitual it no longer costs anything. She has been watching the sky for months, not because she has any theory about what is wrong with it. She has no framework for supervolcanoes, no concept of the upper atmosphere or aerosol veils or global temperature anomalies. She only knows what she can observe, and what she can observe is that the sky has been wrong since before the last cold season, and the cold season before that may have also been wrong, and that the world around her is not producing what it used to produce. The animals that used to move through this area in predictable patterns have not been coming, or they come less often, in smaller numbers, thinner than they should be at this time of year. The plants that used to be reliable are less so. The fresh water sources that the group depends on have been lower than normal for 2 seasons running, but the ocean is still here. That is the thing about the ocean. It does not care about the ash in the upper atmosphere. The temperature of the surface water changes slowly, buffered by the enormous thermal mass of the deep water beneath it, the things that live in it. The shellfish wedged into the rock pools along the tide line, the mussels and limpets and periwinkles that can be gathered at low tide by anyone willing to get their feet wet, are still here. They are not the food anyone would choose if there were other options, but they are food. And food is the whole equation right now. The group she is part of is small. Perhaps 30 people, perhaps a few more. Extended family in the broad sense, people bound together by blood and history, and the simple practical necessity of surviving in groups, because no one survives alone. It was larger once. She remembers when it was larger. The faces she no longer sees in the firelight are not abstract to her. They are specific. She knows their names, or the sounds that function as names. She knows the particular way one of them laughed, and the particular way another walked, and the way a third one smelled when they had been working hard in the heat. They are gone. She does not know she is living through a near-extinction event. She does not know that groups like hers, scattered thinly across this continent, are all that remains of a species that once numbered in the hundreds of thousands. She does not know that the sky has been wrong because a mountain on an island she has never heard of thousands of miles away across water she has never seen tore itself apart and threw its insides into the atmosphere. She knows the fire is small and the group is smaller than it was, and the ocean is still producing, and tomorrow at low tide she will take the children down to the rock pools and they will gather what they can find. She knows that the small one, the youngest, has been coughing in the nights, and that this worries her in a way she does not have precise language for, but that lives in her chest as a constant low pressure, a vigilance that does not fully release even when she sleeps. She knows that the man sitting on the other side of the fire has been talking about moving, going further along the coast to the place where another group was seen last season. She is not sure about this. Moving means leaving the known for the unknown, and the known, difficult as it is, has the advantage of being known. She knows where the water is here. She knows where the predators tend to move. She knows this particular stretch of coastline the way you can only know a place you have lived in long enough that it becomes part of how you think. But she is also not sure they can stay. This is the whole of the decision that faces them: stay in the known difficulty or move toward the unknown possibility. It is not a dramatic decision in the way we might frame it from the outside looking back across 70,000 years. It is a quiet, exhausting, practical decision made by tired people around a small fire on a cold coast, with the sound of the ocean in the dark and the smell of wood smoke in their hair. She looks at the fire for a long time. The youngest one has stopped coughing and is asleep, now pressed against the side of the woman who is her mother, or her aunt, or her older sister. The precise biological relationship is less important than the warmth, the specific warmth of one body pressed against another in the cold. The man across the fire meets her eyes. Something passes between them that is not language exactly, but that operates in the same register as language. An acknowledgement, a shared understanding of the weight of what they are facing, and the absence of any option that does not carry significant risk, and the necessity of choosing anyway. She looks back at the fire. Tomorrow they will go down to the rock pools at low tide. Tonight the fire is enough. Now here is what makes this specific woman, this specific fire, this specific small group on this specific coastline, more than just a survival story. Not far from where she is sitting, there is a cave. It sits in a cliff face above the tide line, looking out over the same ocean she is watching tonight. The wind comes off the water and into the cave mouth at a particular angle, and the acoustics inside are such that the sound of the waves is constant and low, and present no matter how deep into the cave you go. In those layers, in the specific layers that date to the period just after the sky went wrong, there are things that have no practical survival function. Pieces of ochre, the reddish mineral pigment, deliberately ground into powder, not ground accidentally in the process of doing something else, deliberately ground into a fine powder that was then mixed with something to make something that could be applied to a surface. And there are shells, specific shells that have holes drilled through them in a way that is not accidental and not produced by any natural process. Holes drilled so that the shells could be strung together, worn as a necklace. Someone in the period just after the largest volcanic eruption in 2 million years had crashed the global temperature and collapsed the food supply, and reduced the human population of the Earth to a few thousand people. sat down and made jewelry, not because they needed it to survive, because they wanted it. Because something in them, some quality of mind, some capacity for meaning-making that goes beyond the purely practical, required it. Every human being alive today carries her survival inside them. The cave has a name now. Blombos Cave. It sits in a sandstone cliff on the southern coast of South Africa, in a region called the Western Cape, looking out over the Indian Ocean from a height that puts it above the reach of all but the most extreme storm waves. It was first excavated in the 1990s by a South African archaeologist named Christopher Henshelwood. The dominant view in archaeology at the time was that modern human behavior, the full package of symbolic thinking, language, art, complex social organization, emerged relatively recently, perhaps 50,000 years ago, perhaps 40,000. The evidence for it seemed to cluster in that period, particularly in Europe, where the cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira provided spectacular and undeniable proof of minds that were fully, recognizably modern in their capacity for abstraction. The Middle Stone Age of Africa, which predated that European flowering by tens of thousands of years, was assumed to be a simpler, more purely functional time. Henshelwood began digging at Blombos in 1991. What he found over the following years and decades quietly dismantled that assumption so thoroughly that the entire framework of how we understand human cognitive evolution had to be rebuilt around the new evidence. The ochre pieces came first. What Henshelwood and his team found were pieces of ochre that had been deliberately shaped, ground on one end to produce a flat facet. The grinding pattern was intentional, controlled, purposeful. And on those ground surfaces, residue, chemical residue of the kind produced when ochre is mixed with a liquid binder and applied to something, used as a pigment, as something to make a mark with. Then the shells, tiny shells of a species called Nassarius crouchianus, a small marine gastropod, found in the cave deposits in clusters, each one with a hole through it, each hole in the same position on the shell, at the same end, suggesting not accidental perforation, but deliberate, repeated, practiced technique. And on several of the shells, traces of ochre. Jewelry. 75,000 years ago. But the find that stopped the archaeological world most completely came in 2002, from a layer dating to approximately 77,000 years ago. 2 pieces of ochre. What was unusual was what was on them, scratched into the surface of both pieces, using a pointed tool, were patterns, not random scratches. Not the accidental marks of use or transport or storage. Deliberate, controlled, geometric patterns, crosshatch designs, parallel lines crossed by other parallel lines at an angle, producing a diamond grid pattern that is precise enough and regular enough that experimental archaeologists have since spent considerable effort trying to reproduce it. One of the pieces, now known simply as the Blombos ochre, has become one of the most reproduced objects in the literature of human origins. It looks like a piece of reddish-brown stone with some lines scratched into it. Look closer. Those lines were put there deliberately by someone who was thinking about pattern, about regularity, about the relationship between one line and the next, who had a design in mind before they began and executed it, with enough care that the result is recognizable as a design tens of thousands of years later. That is not tool-making behavior. That is not survival behavior in any direct sense. That is art. And the date 77,000 years ago pushed the origin of that capacity back further than almost anyone had expected to find it. at least 25,000 years before the famous cave paintings of Europe. The behavior was not European. It was not new. It was African. It was old. It had been present in our species, in rudimentary but unmistakable form, since before the Toba eruption, and it had survived that eruption in the small populations clinging to the southern African coast and continued on the other side of it. The pressure of near extinction may not only have failed to extinguish symbolic behavior in the surviving human populations, it may have accelerated it. A piece of ochre with a pattern scratched into it is not just decoration, it is a signal. It communicates something about the person who made it, their identity, their group membership, their beliefs, their values, to anyone who sees it and knows how to read it. It is a piece of language made physical, a shell necklace worn by a person from one group, recognized by a person from another group as the same style they have seen before. That necklace is doing something. It is establishing a connection, creating the possibility of trust between strangers. And in a world where the population has crashed to a few thousand people scattered across a landscape that is colder and drier and less productive than it used to be, the ability to maintain connections with people beyond your immediate group is not a luxury. It is survival. The ochre is not just art. The shells are not just jewelry. They are the earliest evidence we have of what will eventually become the thing that most distinguishes human survival from the survival of every other large primate that shared this planet with us. Not the brain, exactly. Not the tools, the network. The survivors did not move quickly. The movement out of Africa did not happen in a generation. It happened across hundreds of generations, each one moving perhaps a little further than the last, following resources, following water, following the slow greening of a landscape that was recovering from catastrophe at its own pace. Think about what a generation of movement looks like at the ground level. A group of perhaps 50 people living in a particular area finds that the resources to their north are somewhat better than the resources where they currently are. Not dramatically better, just slightly better. Enough to make moving worthwhile. They move. Their children grow up in the new location. And perhaps, when those children are adults, they find that the resources a little further north are slightly better still. They move again. 100 kilometers in a century, 1,000 kilometers in 1,000 years. Not as a migration in any conscious or intentional sense, simply as the accumulated result of countless small decisions made by countless small groups, each one just trying to find enough food for the people they were responsible for. Across 50,000 years, it produces a species that has walked to the edges of the world. But the expansion was not smooth. It was not linear. The period between 70,000 years ago and 12,000 years ago was one of the most climatically unstable periods in recent geological history. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, the ice sheets that covered the northern portions of Europe and North America were enormous beyond any easy description. Continuous, unbroken expanses of ice up to 3 kilometers thick, covering everything beneath them so completely that the landscape underneath would not be recognizable for thousands of years after the ice finally retreated. When water is locked into ice sheets on land, it does not return to the ocean. Sea levels drop. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, global sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today. The coastline of the world was in a completely different place. Land bridges existed that are now seafloor. The most famous of them is Beringia, the land bridge that connected what is now Siberia to what is now Azagras, the area currently occupied by the Bering Sea. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, Beringia was not a narrow land bridge. It was a subcontinent, and humans walked across it. When they did, they entered a continent that had never seen them before. The animals of the Americas had no experience of the particular kind of predator that humans represented. Within a relatively short period, the megafauna of the Americas collapsed. The mammoths and mastodons and giant ground sloths and saber-toothed cats and American horses that had dominated the Americas for millions of years disappeared. The same species that had just survived near extinction by the thinnest possible margin walked into a new world and contributed to the extinction of dozens of other species within a relatively short time. That is not a comfortable thing to include in the human survival story. But it is part of the story. And the expansion north and west out of Africa eventually encountered something it had not encountered in the Americas. It encountered people. The Neanderthals had been in Europe for at least 200,000 years before modern humans arrived. They had fire. They had clothing. They had shelters. They had composite tools. They buried their dead. They cared for their injured and elderly. They were not primitive. They were not the shambling, brutish caricature that early 20th century reconstructions produced. They were people, and when modern humans moved into their territory, something happened between the two groups that the archaeological record has been slowly, painstakingly revealing for decades. Something more complicated than simple replacement, something more human. In 2010, a team of researchers led by a Swedish geneticist named Svante Pääbo published a paper in the journal Science that changed in a single afternoon what we thought we knew about the most important encounter in human history. Pääbo had spent the better part of a decade working on a problem that most of his colleagues had considered essentially impossible. He was trying to read the DNA of the dead, not recently dead, dead for 40,000 years. The problem with ancient DNA is not simply that it degrades over time. The deeper problem is contamination. A bone that has been lying in the ground for 40,000 years has been in contact with the soil, with groundwater, with the microorganisms that populate both with the hands of the excavators who eventually found it, with the air of the laboratory where it was processed. Pääbo's team spent years developing the methods, the clean room protocols, the computational tools for distinguishing authentic ancient sequences from modern contaminants. And then they applied those methods to bones from a cave in Croatia. They compared the Neanderthal genome to the genomes of modern humans from different populations around the world. And what they found was this. People of European descent carry, on average, somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. People of East Asian descent carry a similar proportion. People of South Asian descent carry Neanderthal ancestry as well. People of indigenous Australian and Melanesian descent carry Neanderthal ancestry and also ancestry from another archaic human group called the Denisovans. 1 to 4%. It means that at some point, in some place, a modern human and a Neanderthal had a child together. More than once. Modern humans and Neanderthals met. They lived in overlapping territories. They interacted, and at least some of those interactions were intimate enough to produce offspring that survived and reproduced and carried both lineages forward. The Neanderthals did not disappear overnight. Their decline was gradual, playing out across thousands of years. The last known Neanderthal populations, in southern Spain and in Gibraltar, appear to have survived until approximately 40,000 years ago, by which point modern humans had been in Europe for perhaps 10 or 15,000 years. 10 to 15,000 years of overlap. That is not a rapid replacement. That is a long, slow, complicated coexistence. The scenario that the demographic models most consistently support is subtler and more melancholy than outright conflict. Neanderthals lived in smaller groups than modern humans. Their social networks, as far as we can reconstruct them, were more limited in geographic extent. The distances over which they exchanged materials and maintained relationships appear to have been shorter than the distances over which modern human groups were connected. Modern humans had been developing and practicing the capacity for long-distance social networking for tens of thousands of years before they arrived in Europe. The ochre trade routes, the shell bead communication systems, the symbolic behaviors that allowed strangers to recognize each other as members of a shared network. All of that infrastructure of connection was in place before modern humans ever encountered a Neanderthal. And in the long run, in the competition between two groups of similar intelligence in a shared landscape, that difference appears to have been decisive. Not through war, through mathematics. When two groups share a landscape and one has a slightly higher reproductive success rate and slightly better access to resources through its wider network, over 10,000 years, the numbers shift. Slowly at first, then faster, then irreversibly. The Neanderthal populations declined. And as they declined, the interbreeding that had been occurring throughout the overlap period meant that their genes did not disappear entirely. They were absorbed, carried forward into the modern human lineage in that 1 to 4% that shows up in the genome of almost every non-African person alive today. Part of them survived. They were not our enemies. They were not our victims. Exactly. Though the mathematics of demographic replacement is its own kind of fate, and it was not one they chose. They were our relatives, people who sat by fires and cared for their injured and buried their dead and watched the same Ice Age stars we were watching from the other side of a continent, and who, when we finally met them, gave us something of themselves that we are still carrying. The last of them probably did not know they were the last small group of Neanderthals in the caves of southern Spain, living the same daily life they had always lived. Finding food, keeping warm, caring for their children, watching the stars. Would have had no way of knowing that the particular thread of existence they represented was ending. They simply lived the life they had until they could not anymore. And then they were gone, and we were still here, carrying a small piece of them inside us. There is a researcher at the University of Oxford named Robin Dunbar. He is an anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist, and in the early 1990s he published a paper that proposed something so simple and so well supported by the evidence he had assembled, that it has spent the 30 years since then being tested and challenged and refined and debated and holding up. The paper was about the relationship between the size of the neocortex and the size of the social groups that different primate species live in. Across dozens of primate species, there was a consistent relationship. Species with smaller relative neocortex sizes lived in smaller groups. Species with larger relative neocortex sizes lived in larger groups. Living in a group requires keeping track of the other members of the group, knowing who is allied with whom, knowing who owes a favor to whom, knowing who is likely to help you and who is likely to compete with you. All of that is cognitive work. Demanding, continuous, never-finished cognitive work. When he applied the relationship to humans, plugging in the relative neocortex size of Homo sapiens, the number he arrived at was approximately 150. 150 stable social relationships. That is the number that has become known as Dunbar's number. The maximum size of a stable human social group as predicted by the cognitive architecture of the human brain. And then he looked at the empirical evidence, at the size of hunter-gatherer bands across dozens of documented societies, at the size of villages in pre-industrial agricultural societies, at the size of military units across different armies and different historical periods, the Roman century, the modern military company. The number kept appearing. 150 people. That appears to be the natural size of a human community, the group within which every member knows every other member personally, can track their relationships and their history and their reliability, can maintain the kind of trust that allows genuine cooperation without requiring formal enforcement mechanisms. But humans, uniquely among primates, do not stop at the boundary of their personal social network. Dunbar identified what he called layers of social connection. The innermost layer, approximately 5 people. Your closest relationships, the people you would call in a genuine crisis. The next layer, approximately 15. Close friends and family. The next layer, approximately 50. Good friends. The 150 layer, the full community. And then beyond that, the weak ties, 500 acquaintances, 1,500 people whose faces you recognize, and beyond that, the anonymous network of strangers who are connected to you through shared identity, shared culture, shared language, shared symbolic systems that signal membership in the same extended group. These weak ties are not nothing. They are, in some ways, the most important connections of all. Because the weak ties are where information travels, where resources move across distances too large for personal networks to span, where drought in one region triggers a response from another region, not because the people there know the people who are suffering personally, but because they recognize them as members of the same extended network. In a hunter-gatherer context, the weak ties are the connections between groups, the relationships maintained across distances too large for regular contact, through trade, through occasional meetings at seasonal gathering places, through the shared symbolic systems that signal membership in the same extended network. When drought hits one group, it is through the weak ties that news of the drought travels to other groups who might have resources to share. When a new hunting technique is developed in one place, it is through the weak ties that it reaches groups hundreds of kilometers away within a few generations. The weak ties are the immune system of the human social network. And modern humans had better weak ties than any other human group they encountered or competed with. Not necessarily better tools, not necessarily larger brains, not necessarily more individual intelligence. Better networks, wider, more extensive, more robustly maintained networks of weak ties that extended further across the landscape, carried more information, enabled more resource sharing, and allowed local populations to survive crises that isolated populations could not survive. The network was the survival advantage. The Oka moving hundreds of kilometers across southern Africa before agriculture existed. That was the weak tie network operating. The shell beads recognized across distances too large for personal knowledge. That was the identity signal of the weak tie network, the genetic evidence of interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans. That was the weak tie network extending even across the boundary between species. A better spear in the hands of an isolated group dies with that group. A better spear that travels through a network that is shared, copied, improved, and distributed across dozens of groups over a few generations changes the world. The technology is the arrow. The network is the bow. The survival advantage was generosity. Specifically, it was the institutionalized, symbolically maintained, culturally transmitted capacity for generosity toward strangers. We are still here because our ancestors kept deciding to include rather than exclude, to connect rather than isolate, to share rather than hoard. The groups that built and maintained wider connections outlasted the groups that didn't. The species that was willing to absorb strangers into its network outlasted the species that kept to themselves. We are the descendants of the ones who kept the fire going for strangers. Come back down from the numbers again. Come back down to a single evening. It is approximately 100,000 years ago. Two groups have been moving through the same landscape for the better part of a season without encountering each other. Tonight they have found each other. Not through surprise, through the slower, more deliberate process of recognizing the signs of each other's presence over the course of several days and moving toward each other carefully and with intent. They move toward each other rather than away from each other, and that in itself is something. The two groups are not the same. They carry slightly different tool traditions. The particular style of their worked stone is recognizably similar in the broad strokes and distinguishably different in the details. They may camp within sight of each other first, which is the careful way, close enough to communicate intent through the visible signals of normal camp activity, but not so close that either group has committed to anything before reading the signals and finding them acceptable. The children are the first to cross the distance. They always are. A child from one group moves toward a child from the other with the specific purposefulness of a child who has spotted something interesting and intends to investigate it regardless of the social complexity of the situation. The interesting thing is a tool, a small, carefully made blade slightly different in shape from the ones the second child knows, being turned over in small hands with the focused attention that children bring to objects that are recognizably familiar and yet subtly wrong in a way that requires examination. There is a moment where both children look at each other and arrive at the same conclusion simultaneously. The conclusion is you are a person, not a threat, not an abstraction, a person with hands and eyes and the same fundamental curiosity about the world that I have. The adults watching from their respective camps reach the same conclusion approximately 4 seconds later. By the time the fire is built that evening, built between the two camps, not in either one, a neutral space, both groups are around it. The fire is the meeting place. It has always been the meeting place. There is something about the shared fire that is not captured by its practical functions. Something about the way firelight levels the participants. In the dark beyond the fire, difference is emphasized. In the firelight, the differences are still present, but the similarities are more visible. The same hands. The same eyes reflecting the same light. The same way a person leans toward warmth when they are cold. Someone shows someone else a tool, a demonstration, not in words. The demonstration is primarily physical. Watch what I do with this. See how the edge behaves when you work it this way rather than that way. The second adult watches carefully. The technique is slightly better, not dramatically better, just slightly more efficient, producing a slightly cleaner edge with slightly less material waste. In a world where the quality of a tool edge can be the difference between a successful hunt and an unsuccessful one, slightly better matters. This is how human knowledge accumulates across generations in a world without writing. Not through individual genius, not through some mysterious collective intelligence. Through evenings like this one, through the accumulated decisions of thousands of individual groups across hundreds of thousands of years to build the fire between their camps rather than in separate corners of the landscape. To show rather than hide. to trade rather than tide, to let the child cross the distance, because the child's instinct, that's a person, the same as me, is correct. Now the evening is getting late. The children who crossed the distance first are asleep now. Some of them pressed against parents from their own group, and some of them leaning against whoever happened to be nearest when the tiredness arrived. The adults are quieter than they were an hour ago. Not the quietness of unease, the quietness of people who have been talking and demonstrating and exchanging for long enough that the initial work of the meeting is done, and what remains is simply the companionable silence of shared warmth. Someone feeds the fire, not from one group or the other. Just someone, moving because the fire needed feeding and they were close enough and awake enough to do it. The fire is fed. The warmth continues. Inside the circle of light, for a few more hours there is warmth. And people who were strangers this morning are not quite strangers anymore. They were part tomorrow or the day after. They will go back to their separate territories, their separate daily rounds of survival. But the weak tie has been maintained. The connection has been renewed. The knowledge has moved. You are the end of the chain, the latest link in something that began before language and before writing and before history. You got here because of fire shared between strangers, because of tools demonstrated by firelight to people who did not quite speak the same language, because of children who crossed distances that adults had decided were too large, because of 1,000 generations of people who looked at the stranger on the other side of the ridge and decided, despite everything that made caution rational, to build the fire in the middle rather than separately. You are the proof that the decision was right. We have come a long way tonight. In years, 300,000 years, give or take, from the first anatomically modern humans walking the grasslands of Eastern Africa to the person lying in the dark right now, letting this story wash over them like water over stone. And through all of it, through every crisis and every near miss and every moment when the numbers were too small and the conditions were too hard, one thing keeps appearing in the evidence, the same thing that the ochre and the shells at Blombo's cave were pointing toward, the same thing that the long-distance trade routes of ancient Africa were expressing, the same thing that shows up in the interbreeding events with Neanderthals and Denisovans as a form of connection that transcended even the boundaries of species. Connection. The specific, repeated, multi-generational decision to stay connected, to build the fire between the camps rather than separately. To send the ochre down the trade route even when it cost something to do so, to press a hand against a wall and leave a mark that said, "I was here, and I wanted you to know it." To share the shellfish when the shellfish were not enough, because sharing inadequate food with the people around you is still better than eating it alone. To let the child cross the distance, to look at the stranger who was different enough to be frightening and similar enough to be recognizable, and choose recognition over fear. That is the thread. That is what 300,000 years of survival is made of. Connection does not maintain itself. It has to be actively, repeatedly, sometimes effortfully maintained. The ochre trade route worked because specific people kept walking the specific distance to maintain the specific relationship. The weak ties held because people chose, repeatedly, to honor them even when the immediate calculus of individual survival might have suggested otherwise. This is not a comfortable observation. It suggests that the survival advantage is not something our species possesses permanently and automatically. It is something we do, or do not do. A practice rather than a possession. Before we let the night take over completely, come back one more time to the cave. Come back to the hand on the wall. Because we started there, and it is where the story should end. 40,000 years ago, in a cave in northern Spain, someone pressed their hand against cold limestone, in a place so deep inside the mountain that no daylight had ever reached it, put a hollow reed to their lips, and blew pigment around the edges of their fingers until the shape of their hand was fixed into the stone. By the time that hand was pressed against that wall, that person was the inheritor of 260,000 years of accumulated human survival. They carried in their genome the traces of every near-extinction event and every recovery, the Toba bottleneck, the Ice Ages, the long, slow rebuilding of a population that had been reduced to almost nothing and had come back. They carried the Neanderthal DNA. They carried the knowledge that had moved down the ochre trade routes of southern Africa tens of thousands of years earlier. They carried the specific genetic variants that had been selected for in the populations that survived the coastal refuge, the ones that made long-distance social networking not just possible but natural. And they carried all of that into a cave, in the dark with a hollow reed and some pigment, and they made a mark. Not for food, not for warmth, not for any survival function that an outside observer could have justified. They made the mark because something in them needed to make it. And the mark worked. 40,000 years later, you are here. And you know they were. That is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about the whole story. At the chain of connection that has been the subject of tonight, the chain that stretches from the first ochre trade routes to the shell beads to the fire shared between camps to the tools demonstrated by firelight, the chain eventually produced not just survival but this, the desire to leave something behind that another person would find. The understanding that there would be another person, the faith expressed in the act of pressing a hand against a wall in a dark cave that the network would continue. The person who made that mark could not have imagined you, but they knew, in whatever way knowing operated for them, that there would be someone. And there was. There is. Here you are, the latest link in the chain, the most recent beneficiary of 300,000 years of accumulated human generosity and connection, and the specific, quiet, unglamorous courage required to build the fire between the camps when building it separately would have been easier and safer. Here you are, warm, still, breathing slowly in the dark. The weight of the day has lifted by now, or most of it has. The thoughts that felt urgent a few hours ago have moved to a greater distance. They are still there, the way the landscape is still there beyond the firelight, present, real, something to be dealt with when morning comes, but not pressing. Not immediate, not requiring anything of you right now. Right now, nothing is required. Right now, you are simply here. The way the woman on the coastline was simply here 74,000 years ago, with the fire and the ocean and the wrong sky and the weight of the world pressing down and the specific human capacity for endurance that kept her present in it, kept her feeding the fire one more night, kept her doing the ordinary things that ordinary people do in extraordinary circumstances when they have no other option and no guarantee of outcome. She did not know she was going to make it. She could not have known. She made it anyway. And here in the long chain of consequences that stretches from her fire to yours is you. Let the night do its work now. Let the thoughts that are still moving slow down and settle. Let the body go heavy and warm and still. Let the breath do what breath does when it is no longer being managed or monitored or pressed into the service of anxiety or planning, or the endless maintenance of wakefulness. Let it be what it is, slow, regular, the oldest rhythm the body knows. You are at the end of a very long story tonight. not the end in the sense of conclusion. The story is still going, will keep going. Will add your chapter to the chain and the chapters of everyone you love and everyone they love, and on. Forward into a future that is impossible to imagine from here. The end in the sense of the place where you are right now. The latest point. The most recent evening. The current fire. And it is still going. 300,000 years of near misses and population crashes and volcanic winters and ice ages and encounters with strangers who turned out to be relatives. All of it, every moment of it. Every person who kept the fire going one more night when the world was cold and the group was smaller than it had been, led here. To this room. To this breath. To this moment of warmth in the dark. You do not need to do anything with that right now. You do not need to feel anything in particular about it. You do not need to be anything other than what you are, which is the latest and most recent proof that the chain held. That it always held, that the fire that was lit 74,000 years ago on a cold coast in southern Africa, by a woman who did not know she was surviving the worst catastrophe in human history. That fire has never gone out, not once, not in 300,000 years. It has been passed from hand to hand across an unbroken chain of ordinary people making ordinary decisions in ordinary circumstances, not knowing they were maintaining something extraordinary. Not knowing that the small, generous acts of their daily lives were the load-bearing elements of the most successful survival story on Earth. It has been passed down, all the way down, to you, and tonight in the warmth of wherever you are with the weight of sleep beginning to settle on you like the most familiar thing in the world. Because it is the most familiar thing in the world, older than language. Older than fire, older than the first hand pressed against the first cave wall. Tonight the fire is yours. It will be here when you wake. It will be here through whatever the morning asks of you. It was here before you, and it will be here after you. And for now, for this particular darkness, for this particular breath, it is simply here. You are simply here. And that is enough. That has always been enough. Sleep now. The fire is going. It never went out, and it never will.